1010. We're on Chapter 12, Fiscal Policy, okay? We're now going to go into the different things that the government can do to influence our economy. There's two main levers they can pull. Two main levers they can pull. You have fiscal and monetary policy, okay? If you about fiscal, you always hear about people talking about, oh, are they fiscally responsible? What's really talking about your budget, okay? So are you spending or taxing? So when you think about fiscal, you know, someone who's fiscally responsible, what's that person do? They're good with spending money, okay? So the way you spend money, the way you tax money, that is fiscal policy as far as what the government decides to do with those things. So let's go ahead and move on. These are the different learning objectives. We're going to look at what fiscal policy is, what's needed, a multiplier effect, okay? And we're going to look at fiscal stimulus versus restraint and how you put that in, and how it affects the federal budget. Because when you use these tools, there's trade-offs, okay? The goal of this chapter is to understand Keynesian economics and the use of fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. So whenever you see the word Keynesian, that basically means the guy who's focused on demand. You have demand economics. You really have two theories of economics. Support demand or support supply, and figure out which one's more important. Does demand have more pull over the economy and is more important that you make sure you bolster demand, or do you need to go ahead and bolster supply as far as what's going to be better for the economy, okay? Fiscal policy is that AD isn't always compatible with economic stability. So basically, fiscal policy, we're looking at what the AD curve is naturally. What's AD? That's aggregate demand. So that means the entire demand for the nation is AD, and sometimes it just doesn't naturally where we want it, so the government's going to pull some levers to see if they can move it where they want, okay? They're going to look at spending habits with AD, and fiscal policy uses taxes and spending to alter macroeconomics with this, okay? Yeah, so this is macro. We're going to the entire nation here. We're going to do taxes and spending. So it's like I said before, taxes and spending. Okay. Aggregate demand is summarized as AD equals, oh, what are all these numbers? C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. Let's take a look at this. This is the little chart they have for us. This is what the numbers actually are. So government spending is about 18%, okay? 18% of our spending is through the government. Investment, so you have plants, okay? New things for infrastructure. You have consumption, 69%, so basically 70%. And then net exports. Remember, it's a net. So you see that -3 down there? It's a net export, okay? Meaning we export some, but we import a lot more, and therefore it ends up being a negative as far as nets, okay? Consumption, okay, it's final goods and services, so it's things that consumers are spending on. 2/3 of the economy. So basically, just remember, it's 2/3 of the economy. It's about 70%, okay? And consumers vary their spending behavior. They say they go on sprees, then cutting back. This is just what happens. Like when you get a paycheck, okay? How long does it take you to spend that paycheck? Well, depends. You kind of mark out. You're like, well, I got rent. I have some other fixed things that are going to come up. But then you have all this disposable income. And when you have lots of disposable income, you spend it quite readily. But then all of a sudden, once you start running down on disposable income, you start holding back a bit. So that's why they call it spree based. It's really depending when people look and say, hey, I have a lot of extra disposable money. I got my other things set apart. You'll see differences in when people spend. A good example of this would be like when people get their tax refunds back, okay, because they overpaid in taxes. And so they get their tax refunds back. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, I have all this money now. I'm going to go buy stuff. And that's when you see all those sales that go on, okay? Investment, okay, new plants and equipment, plus inventory changes. Because I think, remember, consumption was final products that goods and services. So businesses oftentimes have to keep buying raw resources, and they have to change their inventory. Sometimes they have to upgrade the components in there. And so you're going to have inventory changes as well. It's only when it actually gets sold as a final good does it go into consumer. Investment spending depends on business outlook. Includes production of new plants and equipment. That's the main thing. New plants and equipment. Basically infrastructure for the economy. Government spending. Okay, so it's final on goods and services. 1/5, so about 20%. It's federal, state, and local. So it's not just the national government. It's the state and local government. So all levels of government within the U.S. And remember, as we said this before, we've covered this before in an earlier chapter, does not include income transfers, because if I take money from one person and give it to another person, there's no economic activity that really happened. It was just a transfer of income. Okay, there wasn't some like good or service that was being produced at that point. All right, and then like I said, they're going to go over net exports, trade balance. Obviously, we have a negative trade balance. So all you got to know is that we have a negative trade balance, meaning we ship out a little but get a lot more back. Therefore, we have negative there. And then when we combine all this together, we get the shape, position, and potential shifts of AD. So all these things together are the AD curve. So right there, they're showing us AS. Okay, right there you have AD in red. And if it shifts, you're going to go over and out. Okay, and notice that when you shift, what are the two main things that will happen if you ever shift AD outward? Well, number one, you have the P1 and P2. What are they talking about, P1 and P2? That is price, okay? So prices will increase. In addition, you go from Q1 to Q2, what else happens? What do you guys see? What else happens? Quantity. So we're producing more, okay? We are producing more, but prices will go up. Because in other words, we're producing more, but there's going to be more dollars chasing goods than there are more goods being produced, okay? We're kind of reaching that maximum capacity on our economy. And as we go more towards the end of that AS curve, we get more and more close to that maximum capacity where we're not producing as much as prices are going up, okay? The issue though, with AD1, too little unemployment, because obviously if we can produce from Q1 to Q2, we have a lot of unused materials and goods and things we can do in the economy. So like, hey, we're going to put people out so that we get rid of this unemployment, and then we have people working, okay? However, the drawback, if you go too far, because you see it's a steep curve there with AS, all of a sudden if you go too far, you're going to run into inflation. So you have to balance that. Okay, we want AD far enough over that we're getting rid of that unemployment, but if it goes too far over, what are we going to end up with? Too much inflation. So we got to balance it. Right there, they're showing a balance. If you look at that balance right there, that's sort of like, and you notice, right, we got the AS curve. That's sort of right there where it's kind of the efficiency point of the AS curve. We got a lot more quantity, and prices only rose a little bit. So that good little intersection there, that's what we're looking for, okay? We're okay with a little bit of inflation, but we don't want a lot of inflation, okay? And of course, there we're affecting unemployment a lot. We're narrowing it down. Also, over there they have what's called full employment, okay? So can you produce past full employment? Yes, you can produce past full employment. People work more hours, you can do lots of other things. However, and that full employment basically is like a 3% rate. But that's where you have people working even though it doesn't make sense for them to really work more. And we end up with a curve where we have too many dollars chasing too few products. That's why inflation goes up. So we're kind of too close to that maximum capacity where we become really inefficient and we're paying people a lot more than what's being produced. And again, how do you find out what the AD curve is? You add up all those things. That gives you the AD curve. Okay. So again, the use of government spending and taxes to adjust AD is the essence of fiscal policy. So government's going to use spending and taxes to shift that AD line. That's all fiscal is. They're going to use taxes and spending to shift it. So we have determinants on the left side. So these are the things that can affect AD. Okay. We have internal market forces. Yeah, that'll affect AD. External shocks. Yeah, if you have a big earthquake or disaster, that could affect it. Or if all of a sudden a resource becomes kind of cheap and we find a lot of it, that can definitely affect it. Okay. There's as far as people wanting that resource, I should say they want it. That'd be more supply shift as far as finding it cheaper, but as far as people wanting that resource, finding out a new resource that works good. And then you look at fiscal policy. That's the government, policy levers. Outcomes, the main three things that are going to be affected by doing fiscal policy is output, jobs, and prices. And how do we know that? Remember that graph, those three things we saw? On the very bottom was the output. Okay? And then on the left, there was prices. And also, as we know, if we're doing more output, obviously, we're getting more people employed. So we know those things are directly affected by shifting the AD curve. Other things that can be affected to a degree is growth and international balance. But with fiscal policy, it's going to go directly to output, jobs, and price. Okay. This little graph here, they're going to go ahead and they're going to show you a gap. Okay. They're just going to say, look, when we have what we could be producing, that's a GDP gap. So in other words, if we're not reaching that employment where we're getting rid of more of that cyclical employment where there's just not enough jobs, that's basically GDP we could have had and we lost. Okay, and so we want to make sure we're getting rid of that gap, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to full employment and go move that equilibrium output, so we're actually getting to where we're making more. So you see there, the current one they have at 5.6. 6.0 is where they estimate full employment is. That's where you're about at 3% unemployment. Anything else more than that kind of cuts into the natural unemployment that exists due to structural, which is where people need to get retrained, frictional, where people are moving jobs and looking for new jobs, and then where you have seasonal, where people just aren't working during that time. So full employment is really about 2 to 3%, and when you're moving past that, that's when you get super high inflation. But still, if we're looking here, that's 0.4 trillion. Okay, that's $400 billion we could add to the economy by moving that AD a little bit more to where full employment is. Okay, and so basically what they want to do is they want to eliminate that gap. They say, where's full employment? We want to eliminate that gap, but we don't want to go past full employment because then we reach crazy inflation. Increased government spending and lower taxes are forms of fiscal stimulus. Okay, so how would government spending become fiscal stimulus? Well, government spending is how much of that curve we saw? The AD curve, right, like this, the AD curve? It's 20% of it. So if I increase it and it's part of that curve, it's going to move it. Okay. Also, lower taxes. Who else was part of that curve? Consumers. Consumers were 70%. Okay. Consumption. Okay. And so if I lower taxes, that means they have more disposable income. They can then go ahead and spend that money, and that can also increase AD. Okay, so both those can increase AD. Intended to increase incomes and raise consumer spending. As they say in this, part of each dollar gets spent, and then the main thing, we're going to look at this later, respent. It creates a cycle. There's a ripple effect in the economy, and that's where we get to the multiplier we talked about earlier. Okay, we generate more consumer income and spending. Income gets spent and respent. Okay, so the government spends $100 billion. How's that going to affect the economy if the government spends $100 billion on something? Okay, well, they buy something, so they get products from the market. The sales for the businesses increased by $100 billion. Jobs and wages is where the $100 billion is going to make its way into. Households, okay, and let's say out of that $100 billion, $75 billion led to more consumer spending because people are going to get wages from that. Okay, jobs and wages. At what point, what do those people do with the money, the consumers, once they have it? Well, they're going to spend that $75 billion back into more businesses. At which point, those businesses are going to have to pay wages. Okay, and it keeps going on and on. Okay. The effect of fiscal stimulus on AD includes government spending and subsequent increase in consumer spending due to higher income. So basically, what they're saying is you got the initial, and then you have it where it goes through the cycles. Okay, so the total effect would be the initial and all the cycles added up. Question is, what would that be? Well, we have to look at this number first. We have to figure out what MPC and MPS are. Okay. Individuals decide whether to spend or save new income based on their marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So that means how likely are you to spend for every dollar you have? So if I have $1, how much of that dollar am I going to spend? Okay. And the opposite of MPC is marginal propensity to save. How much of that dollar am I likely to save? So, for example, if I said I had an MPC of 80% by reverse logic, not in reverse logic, just logic looking backwards, you're going to basically see my MPS will be the 20%. It has to equal 1, okay? So I'm either going to consume or save. Nothing just gets left to nowhere. It doesn't disappear. When I have the money, I'm either going to use that money to consume, I'm going to use that money to save, and whatever the percents are, that's what it is. So the percent I'm consuming is MPC, The percent of money I choose to save would be MPS. And that's per dollar, okay? It's a fraction, and MPS is a fraction of income saved. All you have to remember is it equals 1. If it doesn't equal 1, something's off, okay? It should always equal 1. So the multiplier formula provides a new total spending from fiscal stimulus. So rather than having to go through and calculate every single cycle, that's going to take a long time. So we just use an equation with a multiplier, okay? So we have 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, okay? That's your formula right there. That is your formula. Write it down. That'll help you on problems, okay? Here's how they use it. So if MPC equals 0.75, meaning I spend 75% of every dollar I have, okay? So I take 1 minus 0.75, that equals 4, okay? That's the multiplier. The multiplier is going to be 4. And that's basically what you're going to have when everything goes through all the cycles and gets respent, okay? So for every dollar of government spending, AD increases by 4, okay? So on that project, if it was a $100 billion project, like we saw in that past example, and what was the MPC they used? 75. If we keep going, what's going to be the total economic impact? 400 billion, okay, because it's a multiplier of 4. All you have to do is find out what the multiplier is, times that by the initial on spending, and you will get that, okay? This works when you're doing government spending. It's different when we do go to taxes. When we get to tax breaks, that's going to be different. This one, though, we take our initial, and then we times it by the multiplier, okay? So again, that's all you do for spending. So here you go. They're going to go through and show you that cycle here, okay? Suppose that worker is spending 75 cents for every dollar of new income. So first, government buys the missile. So going back actually, let's do it right here. They already have it right here. We don't have to go back to the old one. $100 billion, okay? So right now, that does 100 billion on AD, right? That's going to shift the AD curve 100 billion. And then the second time it goes around, workers buy boats. Well, that'll shift the AD curve another 75 billion. Then the third time it goes around, boat builders buy beer. Okay, that's 56.25 billion. So that shifts out more. And on the right side, you're going to see on the right side the cumulative effect. So we go from 100 to 175 to 231 to 305 to 328. How far will that cumulative go to? Well, it's going to max out at around 400 billion. Okay, and if you look as far as the money going through the cycle, it's getting siphoned off bit by bit because every time you're siphoning off 25 cents. That's what they're saving every cycle. So 25% of it gets cycled off, okay? And so as you go through this, it just makes it really simple. Rather than having to figure out every single step, that's what the multiplier allows you to do. I can just say straight up, they're doing 100 billion, and this is what the MPC is. MPC is 75. That's what they're spending. Then I know exactly where we are, okay? The change in spending is determined by the multiplier times the initial change in government spending. So that's all you do. So if you find out what the multiplier is, say it's 5, and the initial change in government spending is 100 billion, then 500 billion will be what happens overall. Let's say the initial change in government spending is 50 billion, and the multiplier is 3. Well, then you'd end up with 150 billion as it goes through all the cycles. So you have the initial plus all the cycles. That ends up being together, okay? So here, suppose the multiplier is 4 and the government increases spending by 100 billion. What should it be? I think I've given you the answer several times. 400 billion. That's simple, okay? And this is what's really interesting, because basically what it lets us know is, like, whenever we increase AD, okay, there's going to be cycles that ripple. And the same thing, if ever AD contracts, the cycles will go backwards too. Okay, so ripples. This one, when people talk about ripples in the economy, this is what a ripple in the economy is. Okay, the GDP gap is closed by the direct impact of government spending and subsequent increases in consumer spending. So what happens is, naturally we get to about here, and then we find out, oh, if we go a little bit further, we can reach full employment. We can get to where we want. We're not going to get approaching to where we have super high inflation yet. We can get to a good part of that curve. The government does the final tweaks to get you up there, okay? And right here, they're going to show you there's a current price level, okay? 5.6. Okay, the government spends $100 billion, okay, and the MPC, I'm assuming they're going to still use the 0.75 on this. If we're at 5.6, where are we going to move to? Well, 100, and the multiplier was 4. 100 billion times 4 is going to be 400 billion, so that 5.6 is going to keep moving all the way until we reach over there. Okay? So you have the direct of 100 billion is the direct, and the indirect is it going around in the cycle. That's 300 billion, and that's where we'd end up. So basically with this, the government can fine-tune. They can look at it and be like, well, if we put this much money into it, and this is the current MPC of our consumers in the economy, we expect it to have this big of a ripple, so we're going to end up about here on the line. Okay? Government can close the GDP gap by cutting taxes. This is the other way they can do it. So remember, spending's part of it, but the other way is to cut taxes. Let's see how it works. So it's pretty close, but there's a little bit of difference. Okay. Okay. A tax cut directly increases disposable income and stimulates the economy. Okay. Stimulates consumption or investment. Okay. Now this is what's interesting. The initial change in spending is not the tax cut. Okay. Not the tax cut itself, because you have to. It's skipping a step, so it's going to change a bit. So it's MPC times tax cut. In other words, the first step, they don't spend everything, because when the government decides to spend something or do a project, they spend all 100 billion. But if I gave the tax cut to consumers, they would save on that very first initial step and siphon out whatever amount based on their MPC from that first step. Okay? So the change in spending is determined by the multiplier times the initial change in spending. Okay? Suppose the MPC is 0.75, the multiplier is 4 million, and tax cut, or should just be 4. So, well, I guess they're 4M, they're using M for the multiplier. Usually when I see M, that's millions. So. And taxes are cut by 100 billion. Alright? So, all they're doing here is rather than spending 100 billion, they're doing a tax cut by 100 billion. What's the difference? How much is it going to move AD? What's the difference? Okay. The initial change in spending is 0.75 billion. Okay. So we take that 75 billion, and then that's going to go by the multiplier. 300 billion. So what did we see? Basically, what's the most effective way to move AD per dollar? It will be government spending, because the government does not save when they do a government project. However, that might not be what people want. Maybe you're trying to relieve people directly. You need to get the money to them faster. There could be some issues. Tax cut will do that. It will still move AD, just not as much. So again, look at the math real quick. So you take the initial change in spending, okay, which if it's 100 billion and the MPC is 0.75, that means only 75 billion is going to go into that cycle, and then that 75 billion times the multiplier. Okay, so basically you have to do one more added step as far as your calculations, because of the way it's set up. Okay, and that's pretty much it with this. Is because you're putting it directly into the economy, you don't get that extra bonus of that 100 billion. And that's the difference if you look at it, okay? Because remember it's 400 billion if the government spends it. So you take out that step and you're basically starting on step 2. And so you end up with 300 billion. Okay? And just look at this, try to absorb it. I don't think there's any other way to explain it better to you. Overall, you just have to remind yourself, the government will always put all the money in when it spends it. Consumers, if you give the money directly to consumers, even on the first step, they're going to hold back, and therefore you have to do the math like this. That's why you have to go through and do the initial change in spending, which is, even though it's a $100 billion tax cut, they're only going to spend 75 billion at the start, and then you calculate that 75 billion in the whole circle. So it's just, that's all it is. While fiscal stimulus closes the GDP gap, it may also cause inflation. We've gone over this several times. Okay, you will have some inflation going any way out, but you just don't want too much inflation. Okay, AS curve slopes upwards, so any increase in AD raises output and the price level. And what they're trying to do is balance. That's all they're saying here. Is policy makers weigh the benefits of full employment over the cost of higher prices. And they're trying to find that efficient balance point where they feel they're doing good. Okay, fiscal policy also fights inflation. Okay, So if inflation's the issue, you can just move things backwards. You can cut government spending, or you can increase taxes. And it'll do the exact opposite. Okay? You just move in reverse. So you can shift the AD curve left, and when you shift it left, prices will go down. Okay? And also the amount we produce will go down. Okay? Again, they've said this several times, that the goal is to match it with full employment, not get too far to the left, try and get people to that unemployment rate of about 3%. Fiscal strategy for attaining the goal is to shift the AD curve. Okay. Guidelines for fiscal policy as follows. Okay, take some time here and just look at this slide. This is probably the nutshell of this chapter. Okay, you have unemployment. What do you need to do? Well, if I increase AD, that's going to make us produce more. If we're producing more people have jobs. Okay. So what can I do? I can increase spending, or I can cut taxes. That'll move AD. The problem's inflation, meaning I'm too far over on the curve up here. So I'm moving up on that AS curve and I'm too far up here. Okay. Then I need to decrease AD, so I can decrease government spending or raise taxes, and that will shift it back. Okay. Also with fiscal policy, usually this results in unbalanced government budgets because they're spending money they don't have. They're usually having to take loans and whatnot. Okay. And so it'll be relative to tax revenue, and hopefully they're thinking they can make it up in future years based on economic progress. And overall, this is something that's pretty simple. Budget deficit, whenever government spending is more than what they're bringing in, that's a budget deficit. Yeah, the government's debt grows, changes by the difference between government spending and tax revenue. Okay, so they're saying the exact same thing again. When the government has a budget deficit, it must borrow to finance a portion of the spending. Yep. So where do they get the money? They have to get a loan for it. They have to finance it. Okay. Fiscal stimulus increases budget deficit. Usually that loan could be bonds. It can be all sorts of ways they can do it. Fiscal restraint decreases budget deficit. So if you're ever going back, obviously if you're cutting spending and increasing taxes, you're going to have less deficit. And if you have too much inflation, you're doing two things at the same time. You're cutting your inflation, plus you're getting rid of your budget deficit. This is just overall history. So based on this graph, do we tend to run deficits? Yes. We run a lot of deficits. This is from 1980 to past 2010. You can see there, we got a couple of years past 2010. Yeah, very short time, year 2000. It was basically during the dot-com boom. We were taxing people a lot more. And then when that busted, we had even bigger deficits to make up for that. So 2000 was the dot-com bust. After the year 2000, then dot-com bust and whatnot. Yeah, that's about it. So overall, we're usually running deficits, and they have been increasing. Again, Keynesian economics focuses on demand. Okay. Balanced budget only occurs when AD is consistent with full employment and equilibrium. Okay. What they're saying is equilibrium is where it's going to be naturally, and if we get lucky and that natural equilibrium is at full employment, then we have a balanced budget. But if not, if that natural equilibrium is not there and we're trying to move AD left or right, then we're either going to get a deficit or a surplus. Okay. And this is it. Fiscal policy. Why fiscal policy is needed. And the multiplier. Remember, I'm just going to go over this one more time with that multiplier, okay? If you get the multiplier in your spending, you just straight out times it by the initial spending, okay? If you're doing a tax cut, realize people are going to save money on that first step, so you got to times that multiplier by that initial spending. So if it's, let's say it's let's go 0.5, okay? Let's say MPC is 0.5, okay? Well, what would happen if I'm doing a tax cut? Well, if I do a $500 billion tax cut and MPC is 0.5, only $250 billion will go into the first step. And then after that, you take your multiplier, so you do that equation for the multiplier, which would end up being 2, all right? And then you would only end up with, well, Do the math. What's 2 times 250? 500 billion. That's all it would be. So. And yeah, that's it. Play around with that. Work the equation a couple times. It starts to make sense as you go through it. Hopefully this works for you all. We're almost through. You guys are doing a good job. Okay, take care.